Welcome to UPSC Radio Podcast, India's first podcast for UPSC. I'm your host, Dinesh Tundakurti, lecturer, civils faculty, and RTA activist. We are in episode 18 of season 4, and in this episode, we have a special guest with us, Saket Surya, from PRS Legislative Research. And in this episode, we will be discussing on how does the parliament work, what is the relevance of Rajya Sabha, role of president in parliamentary democratic system, about post-COVID revival, and the role of reservation for women in parliament, and various other aspects. And before going into the episode, we have a small announcement. Because of the COVID-19 crisis that impacted every one of us, and particularly to agricultural community, farmers, laborers, the family belonging to them. So here do we offer a free initiative for a guidance session in Telugu for these people. And there is a form below the description. Click on the form and fill up your details and join the session online in Google Meet, which will be discussing about the basics of civil services, and it will be basically a guidance session with mains answer writing. So welcome to the episode. So the basic question that many of us get is, what is the difference between legislative and executive? We often do confuse who is my MP is both executive and legislative. We call sometimes like that. So who is an executive and legislative?
Okay. So if we see how the governance in India is designed as per our constitution, it is based on the doctrine of separation of power. And that happens through three kinds of function of governance being divided into three different branches of the state. So you have executive, whose job is to implement a law. Uh, you have legislature, whose job is to make law, and then there is judiciary, whose role is to interpret law. So there is a clear delineation between the kind of functions when it comes to governing the country. So implementing law is with the executive, making law is with the legislature, and interpreting law is with judiciary. So that's the basic difference when we talk about executive and legislature, for instance. Now, if you look at the question that you asked, what happens to what exactly is my MP? Is he an executive? Is he part of the legislature? So when we elect an MP, he is part of the legislature. But as we know, the executive is appointed from the legislature. A group of the council of ministers and the prime minister is chosen among the legislators that we elect as during we send to our legislature after the elections. So those MPs who become part of the council of ministers and the prime minister, then they form the part of the executive branch of the government. So in a way, executive in Indian parliamentary system emanates from the legislature itself. So when an MP is not a minister, he is part of the legislature. When he becomes an minister or when prime minister, then they form part of the executive.
And if so, we already have Lok Sabha where we elect our MPs to, it's not just to rule us, to represent us. So when we already have Lok Sabha, why do we need Rajya Sabha where we can't elect them? And what is the role of Rajya Sabha in the democratic system?
So when our constitution was being framed, there were two broad arguments when it came to appointing a second chamber. That is, this two houses system is called bicameral legislature, or there is a popular house, there is a house which is indirectly elected. Okay, so first argument was that the the second house will act as sort of a speed breaker when a popular house with lot of majority does something in haste. The second house can, which is elected and replaced at a slower pace, because it's only one third of the representatives which are being replaced. So a party which may have majority in, say, at the start of the first 5-year term in Lok Sabha may not have the same kind of majority in Rajya Sabha. So it ensures that there is some uh, second check, some balance when it comes to hasty passage of legislation. And the second thing was that there may be people who are eminent who could contribute to this whole law making process, but they may not be either able to win election or may not be interested in doing that. So they also get a chance to participate by being a representative in the house. Now, another role that Rajya Sabha plays, because we have a federal structure, right? We have states, and India has been called Union of States in our constitution. So our Rajya Sabha is also a house which represents states in the federal legislature. In parliament, it is the house which represents the interest of the states. So that's another important role that Rajya Sabha has when we look at the role in overall parliament. So one being the check or the speed breaker, if you can call it, and the second is that it is uh, uh, it is the representative of the states in the federal.
It is like a big brother to the Lok Sabha. If something bad happens or like something have to be double checked, it will be doing as because they are elite and eminent people. I won't say elite because there's eminent people from various backgrounds. And I just want to know what is PRS legislative and what they do for this democracy, because many of the representatives do follow PRS and website, and many of Indians do follow. But to our audience and to the public, can you please elaborate what is your work and what is this PRS do for this democracy?
So if you just look at so we have Indian Parliament. If you look at the legislatures in the country, we have Indian Parliament, and then there are state legislature, legislative assemblies, and council. In councils are of course there in only 6 states, but all states have assemblies along with the two UTs, three now, Puducherry and Delhi and JNK, which will have once elections happen. So if you look at the number of members in these houses, the Indian Parliament alone has about 790, 800 members from over 40 political parties. And if you look at the kind of numbers these people represent, so probably on average an MP represents close to 2 million citizens. Okay. Now, Parliament passes a lot of bills in a year, somehow somewhere between 30 to 50, and there's a lot of increasingly we are seeing the uh, budgetary processes or the kind of regulations that government is making. This all is becoming more technical, more complicated, complex in structure. So MPs do not have they do not have the support in within the institution to help them navigate through these complexities. So as an MP, probably I would like some background research done to me, things broken down in a simple manner, so that I can understand the subjects and the range of subjects that I have to deal on a daily basis. Right? So the idea of PRS is then to deepen and broaden this legislative process by providing our MPs with necessary research support, which will help them in their work in Parliament, both in committees as well as uh, on the floor of the House when they participate in bills, etc. So the way we go about is we give them concise analysis of bills. There's research notes on various kinds of policy issues. We provide data which could be relevant to the debates that they are participating in, and we do that in a non-partisan manner. So we provide research support to all MPs and MLAs across all party lines. And the other areas of our work involve tracking actively the functioning of legislature and legislators by releasing detailed data and analysis. And that helps in informing citizens about the working of our legislature and improving the public engagement about the legislative process. We also run a fellowship called LAM, where young individuals get an opportunity to work with members of parliament and see the policy making process uh, from close quarters. So these are all the avenues through which PRS is trying to strengthen the legislative process in the country and contribute towards a more robust democracy in our country.
And we have a parliamentary form of democracy which is so mature and so one of the biggest in the world. Then what is the role of president? We can directly make prime minister as a head, right? All call a complete head of the system because we elect MPs. Then why do we have one more organization, one more thing as president and president born and all? What they do, what does they do in this parliamentary form of democracy?
Okay, so if you see the president in our country, say, he or she is a figurehead. It's a ceremonial head of the state. So now you have to distinguish between state and the government. So there is the state. When we say the state, that means the country India, and then there is a government. So government may come and go. The state always remains. So there is a figurehead for that. And one of the things that say president does is appoint invite governments to be formed when the party has a majority. So it kind of ensures that there is some amount of continuity that is there when governments come and go. So that way, president is the head of the state that India is, and the prime minister is head of the government.
Can't we elect presidents directly or governors in the state? Is there any problem in electing them and giving same amount of powers like as in CM or PM?
So wouldn't that create a balanced structure that you have two centers of power here? I mean, the idea is that there's a ceremonial head of the state, and then there's an executive or the government of the day, which has been appointed through the will of the people, and that comes and goes. But you may not like to have two centers of power at the same time, like governor and chief minister competing for the same kind of powers for doing the same thing. So that kind of conflict you want to avoid. So they remain as the head of the state, or uh, but the actual power is enjoyed by the person who has been appointed by the will of the people, who has been elected by the people, and chief minister and the prime minister remains accountable to the citizens of the country, right? Every 5 years they have to pass the test to be able to continue. So that also ensures that that's the, I mean, the essence of the democracy, that people who have been chosen to govern are ultimately answerable to people. So that's why the power, the all the power that government has rests with the chief minister and the council of ministers, as compared to say a governor or a president who has been elected by or appointed in a way elected by the representatives of the people.
Crores of Indians do ask this question in various debates and various meetups. I do elect my MLA in state or MP in Lok Sabha, but if they change political party, it can be various reasons. It can be local reasons or political reasons or constitutional reasons. That doesn't matter to us. But do you think anti-defection law is not up to the mark in affecting them while they do change the party?
So we have to probably go back and see why anti-defection law came in first place. Right? So there was a lot of governments which fell because some people were promised way back in 60s and 70s sometime that people were promised a more lucrative post or position from the different side. Okay, so people often switched parties, and that sort of led to some form of instability of the government, because probably through money you could lure people to your side, and with a better promise, probably there the person was an MLA, here he or she becomes a minister. So that kind of offers led to this kind of instability, or probably political ethics or the party sanctity that should have been there. When people choose, probably they are also choosing the representative and also a party which will form the government. So that was somehow said to be or construed to be undermined, and that's something anti-defection law came to stop. But now the anti-defection law changes things entirely. it essentially undermines now the role that a legislator has, or the independent decision making process that he or she has uh, to he or she has to deploy, or because there is no incentive to do that anymore, because almost every decision can be taken by a few people in the party, and party would issue a whip, and if the legislator does not follow that, then he or she may be disqualified. Okay, so this leads to the overall undermining of the institution of the legislator itself, I would say. So how does that happen? One is that if you look at the anti-defection law, okay, so when we were talking about executive and legislature, one key role that legislature has to perform is to hold the executive accountable, right? That is through various means of deliberation and various means of seeking information, etc., that they have through which they hold the government accountable. Now, suppose a is being bill is being introduced by a minister from the ruling party, and the ruling party can place a whip, and if the someone from that party does not agree with the bill, he or she has no choice but to vote as per the whip, because otherwise they stand disqualified. Okay, now as a representative, we also have to represent the will, or represent the interest of the constituency that we represent. So the same bill probably may not be suitable for all constituencies, or in the interest of all constituencies being represented by members of the same party. Say there is a bill on river water sharing, something like that. Maybe, or
Yes.
say Kaveri dispute. So legislators from two states from the same party may not agree on the same kind of solution, but whip would mean that both will have to vote in the same way. So that somehow undermines the kind of power, kind of ability that legislators were given in the first place to represent the interest of the constituency. And the other way, if you see, the people can also not hold the legislator accountable in that case. If I have to vote as per my party's will, and my people ask me why did I not vote, or why did I not take a position in a certain manner, I have the shield of saying that this, I am being forced to do that because that is the law of the land. So it kind of, in a way, undermines both the processes. The role of the legislator itself in terms of the choice, independence that they can exercise, and the second way, their accountability to the people, or the ability of people to hold their representatives accountable, is also undermined at the same
Do you think just because of this anti-defection law, the internal democracy in a political system is somewhere or the other, is undermined? The independence of the decision making of an MP or MLA is threatened. I don't use even the word threatened, but it is undermined at some part of the time.
So the way I would put it is that essentially what's happening is that legislators don't have means to represent their own voice. Okay, so if there are few people in the party who can exercise, who can make decision on behalf of the party, they can simply ask to place a whip, and everyone else has to comply. So that is how the decision making then. So the idea that parliament would be a deliberative body, and our legislators will then enable that deliberation, that scrutiny, etc., then kind of gets defeated, because a few people in the party can decide and they can place whip and get that thing in it.
And if we come to Lok Sabha, I think you know the famous bill, one of the most famous bills in the Indian history is Women Reservation Bill from 1996 in till 2021. It has been pending in one of the other houses. I think it was passed in Rajya Sabha in 2008, but later there was no, not even an MP or a minister. No one has talked about that. And even the recent 2017 United Nations report on women in politics, we have been ranked as 148th place, which is, so I don't say worse, but bad. It is very bad. So, do you think women reservation bill, why it is getting lagged? We don't want to go into politics here, but why it is getting lagged for these many years? And do you think with this one mantra or signature from the president or gazette notification, everything gonna change in the society?
I think if we look at the women's reservation in, say, one thing that has been long pending is the women's reservation in Parliament and State Assembly, which has to be enabled through a central act or an act passed by Parliament. The, when constitutional amendment to local for in Panchayati Raj institution, etc., happened, then women's reservation was built in, and we have seen a direction where women's reservation has been increased in many states from 33% to 50%. It even happened last year. So, in some ways, it is happening at that level, at the state, at the central level where it has to happen for parliament and, of course, state assemblies. So far, there has not been an agreement. The highest progress that we had was when that 2008 bill, if I'm not wrong, which was there, and it was probably passed by Rajya Sabha, introduced in Rajya Sabha and passed. It's still pending technically because bill which has been introduced in Rajya Sabha doesn't lapse, unlike a bill which is introduced in Lok Sabha, which lapse when a government is changed or when its time is over. So the answer to the question that why this has been long pending, you have to probably say that it's a matter of political will that these bills are passed. And answer to, is it the only means or for women empowerment, or will it change everything in one stroke? Probably the answer is no in both cases. I mean, there are countries where there may not have been women's reservation, but by enabling right policies for empowerment of women, etc., we may see a better result. And on the other hand, we see some problems here and there when, say, representation is enabled. We see that the proxies are replaced. So it's essentially, uh, if there was no reservation, there would have been a male candidate. But when reservation happens, probably a relative, female relative of a male candidate is placed, and then they become figureheads, etc. But at the same time, the experience shows at the local bodies level that when women representatives are elected, they work for the constituencies of women, and at the same time, there's a greater confidence and assertion that comes in with the participation of women in the power structure in the politics. So that's all I say.
Yes, yes, yes. Because as you know, we have to empower them, but that empowerment should not be come from above. It should come within us and surrounding us. It can be behavioral change, or it can be anything.
So there have been some recommendations that instead of, say, reserving seats in parliament or assembly, you could rather reserve in the political party, or have that, and that may give them a better choice, greater flexibility, etc. That based on constituency paradigm in terms of voter calculations, etc.
There is this huge uproar in many parts of India, and particularly in northwest and central India, to implementation. The agri bills like Farm Produce Trade Bill or Farm Services Bill or Essential Commodities Act, which has been passed. So, do you think these uh, actions by the central government or parliament can bring structural changes in the agricultural sector, or reforms that have been waiting from the past decades? Do you think these acts can bring those aspirational things that our farmers are
So if
aspiring
you look
for?
at the direction that these bills are taking, okay, and if you look at the performance or functioning of APMCs, and there have been numerous committees which state that APMCs in current form need improvement in terms of their way of performing, their way of performing, etc. So that needs to be uh, changed. So the call for change has been there for quite some time, and the direction that this bill is taking is that it is limiting the powers of the APMCs in the physical boundaries of the mandi, and it is allowing people to sell uh, things outside it without any restriction. So you have basically parallel markets. One market which is the APMC regulated market, where the existing laws etc. would apply, and the second market which has been enabled by the central act, which allows people to sell without restrictions, and there is limit. There is prohibition on charges that on fees or that state government can impose to make to create a competitive market, or a market driven by market principle, where there is a better not better, I would say, if there is a more competition, and that would enable a better price for the farmers. So that's the basic idea that the one of the three bills that parliament has passed brings in. So it creates a parallel market as with APMC, and limits the kind of boundaries to which APMC's powers would apply. Then there are two other bills. One is on the essential commodities, which again limits the kind of powers government used to have on imposing stock limits on farm produce, and give relaxes some imposition and makes it on the base and provides a basis on which these kind of decisions could be taken. And then there is uh, the third bill, which provides framework for contract farming essentially. So now the we have seen the experiences, like in Bihar APMCs were abolished, but that not necessarily uh, led to creation of better market infrastructure. Even the kind of it was observed that the kind of market structure that was in place, it because there was no upkeeping happen, so it also deteriorated. So on one hand, probably the kind of structure which is completely devoid of regulation may not really work in this case. So that's the kind of parallel that these bills are creating, and that is where probably the concerns are, that how this is going to be implemented and what kind of repercussions it would bring to farmers as compared to APMCs that have, uh, and if farmers will be exposed to the vagaries of the market, that prices fluctuate a lot, or what kind of bargaining power they would really have, right, when it comes to a free market for farmers.
Yes. And one last question before we conclude here. I think we have been experiencing this bad crisis, COVID 19 second wave, particularly, where the whole economy, I don't say collapsed like in first wave, but trying to rebound. So, what do you think the government or the people or various institutions like RBI or anyone have to do for this rebounding of our economy to bring back to the correct format, like supplying demand and supply crisis or whatever it is. So in your opinion, what everyone has to do and government has to do
I mean,
for
like,
this bounce
yeah,
back?
I'm not in a position to make recommendations on these things, but I can tell you, like, what are some challenges that could be there. So one challenge that we have to see is that our economy was anyway not doing that well before pandemic. Okay. There was a slowdown in demand, and that was happening, and that all has been aggravated by the pandemic last year, and this year the second wave also will have some sort of impact in that direction. The second thing is that with the differentiating impact that pandemic would have on life and livelihood, So there could be cases of rising unemployment, rising inequality, and rising poverty. So the kind of developmental gains we would have made in these directions, that also gets impacted. Then you have various classes of vulnerable population who would be disproportionately hit by the pandemic. So, for instance, school children who depended on government schools not only for education but also for nutrition. Although governments have tried their best to solve the issues around midday meal through, say, cash transfers or delivering their food in to their home, like I think it happened in Kerala. Some states have gone the cash transfer way, but the kind of differentiating impact this could have on, say, children of who were supposed to get education and nutrition both in school. So there's whole lot of challenges in that direction that needs to be taken care of. And so these things, I think, and the third, all amidst all of this, because economy wasn't doing well, etc. Even earlier, government finances are not in that great shape, and with pandemic, there has been unprecedented rise in government's debt levels, etc. Because they they were seeing shocks in both ways. Their revenues had declined at the same time the expenditure needs increased. So to balance that, the government had to resort to debt. So that has led to rise in government debt. So uh, that would also be a challenge that government has to find resources to provide boost to the economy. So these are some challenges to the post-COVID revival or that we are talking. And we are seeing with second or third wave or fourth wave probably. So that also has to be carefully
Yes.
calibrated in order to not only protect life, protect livelihood, balance it out both, you know, more calibrated.
So, do you think if we go for one more lockdown and to stop this third wave, are we ready for these consequences of one more lockdown?
Of course, lockdown has consequences in terms of economic activity collapses with very strict lockdown, or it significantly reduces. It especially hits hard those people who are, say, uh, dependent on daily wages, etc. And that's a good chunk of our population. So they first get this. So there is probably these kind of vulnerable classes. They need to be supported further by government if there is a need for lockdown. But world over, we are seeing that subsequent bouts or subsequent waves have forced governments to re-bring lockdown measures, etc., in some or other form. To balance it, you probably have to support these kind of vulnerable populations.
On this note, I will conclude this episode podcast one. So, thank you, Saket, for bringing your views to us and
Okay.
educating and empowering our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.